To give you a little bit of beekeeping 101, answer questions that you have, and just really share some great information. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Thomas from Malivo. They are one of our beekeeping suppliers. So wealth of information. I think you guys are going to learn a lot and have a lot of fun. So Thomas.
Thank you. So just thanks you guys all for showing up, braving the weather and stuff to come out. It's been pretty stormy. So it's great to have you here. Thanks, Coastal, for putting this together for us. I just have a couple things to go through, and then I'll turn the time over to Justin. But we are, as Malivo, is a proud sponsor of Project 8%. So that's the largest nonprofit to beekeeping health and promotion of research. And so anything that you guys do and you buy from Coastals will come in, 5% of those proceeds will go to donation to them. You can go to Malivo.com and check out more information about what Project 8%. There's a link that takes you right to it. And you can see more about PAN. Another resource that we do, beekeeping is a local activity. Like I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah, so I'm going to be keeping bees a little bit different than what you guys are going to be doing here. A lot of the information is going to be the same, but you're going to want to get and find people in your area that are keeping bees too, so you can find mentors and stuff. Just like gardening, it's going to be a little different seasonality at different places. So once again, at Malivo.com, we have a resource that we've set up on Facebook. We have one in every state. I have one in every province in Canada. It's to connect with beekeepers in your area. So if you go to Malivo.com, there'll be a link to it. You can find Keeping Bees in Oregon, or you can go on Facebook and search for Keeping Bees in Oregon or Washington or your area and find this resource. And it's great because you can post pictures. You can ask for mentors. You can say, hey, just like you were talking about, we were talking a little bit earlier with a lady here that is having problems with their hive, and she could post pictures on there and ask and say, hey, what's going on with this? And you'll have a bunch of people chime in and answer. So it's a great resource. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Justin Brown. He's the inventor of Apicare. It's a natural treatment that treats a wide variety of different stuff, and we're going to be bringing this out to Coastal. He's going to be taking you through a Beekeeping 101 course, and then talking about a little bit of the benefits of Apicare at the end. So thank you, guys.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, I'm Justin Brown. I'm the inventor of Apicare. We've been more focusing on the commercial market than anything. That seems to be the more prevalent problem before we get to really the hobbyist level. But luckily, Malivo is a partnership with this to distribute it, to bring it to you guys now. It's a 100% natural supplementation to basically prevent a wide array of viruses, bacterial diseases, and sublethal level doses of pesticides. So I'll get more on that later on, but this is the basic of the package of what the product looks like. For what we're going to start with first is basically a basic introduction to beekeeping, what type of equipment that you're going to use, which we have a pretty prime example here. This is the Langstroth hive, otherwise known as the Langstroth hive. It was invented by Lorenzo Langstroth in 1851. Basically, the reason for this hive was because most of the other beehives that you had to completely destroy it in order to extract either the honey or to do anything with it. Plus, you couldn't really observe your bees that well. They did have what was called a leave book hive that would open like a book, but at the same time, it was really, really inconvenient. So basically, the reverend, he was a reverend, came up with this idea. He also discovered what was known as the bee space. So what the bee space is basically there's a specific gap in between the frames. And what that gap is they came to find that the bees won't propolize or comb that gap in between the frames. So it made it a lot simpler for people like us to be able to open the hive and not have everything all glued together, and you could remove the frames real readily. And that was a real advantage, because now we had the ability to be able to work the hive internally without having to destroy it. So that was a real big thing. We'll also go over the basic bee biology, kind of, what you're going to be looking at as a bee as a whole. Its tongue, it's proboscis for, the more technical term. It's corbiculae for its pollen baskets, things like that. Just real simple terms of the bees, the stinger. Nothing real major. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about, the glands that develop during certain stages of the worker bee's life that is used to feed the larva and the other bees, and that's what you're going to want to look at. Like I'll discuss what you actually want to see in the hive, so that you can tell that you're getting a proper amount of food for that beehive as well. It's a real easy indicator to look at. We'll get into that when we get up there. Then obviously setting up the apiary and management. So we're going to discuss kind of an ideal location for your beehive. Also what type of conditions that you would like to have in your beehive, in your bee yard. So that way you'll prevent as much as possible of your bees interacting with anybody that you don't want them to interact with, like maybe your neighbors or certain pets or animals or stuff like that. So we'll talk about flight patterns and flight yards and stuff like that. And then we'll go over the beekeeping year at a glance. Basically, that's what seasons that you should expect. Most likely, like wintering, what you'll do for wintering, spring, fall, stuff like that. So that's the kind of stuff that we're going to start going through. And so we'll start with the basic breakdown of the Langstroth beehive. So basically, what I pulled off here is the actual top lid. There's a few different types. There's a migratory lid, and there's this full cover lid, such as this. This is basically just to prevent the bees from, or any other pests that, come in. The real advantage to these types of lid, too, is that it surrounds the entire exterior box, so you don't really have to worry about it tipping over and falling off. It's kind of nice to have. Plus, it looks really nice as well. So after that, we go to an interior lid, which is basically this. It's just to, as well, keep a protective layer for the bees to prevent you from, dropping something on it or them flowing out of the lid too much, things like that. This lid doesn't probably form a complete seal with the box, so the bees will have an easier time of sealing this lid off as well, because most bees, if you come in to see in time, they like to seal their hive very readily. That way it can keep out different environmental conditions, but at the same time it can keep out other bees, pests, stuff like that. Plus propolis is antimicrobial, so they like to basically spread it everywhere because it helps prevent bacterial diseases as well. So that is the next part of the hive. After that, we're coming down to your supers, or your honey storage. This one's considered a medium. It seems to be a little bit more accessible for people, than using a deep for honey storage, because these, once they're full of honey, basically they can weigh up to about 100, 120 pounds a piece. It can become very, very difficult to move that around readily. These ones are looking more about 45 pounds, a lot easier to use. The frame width stays basically the same. The only thing that actually changes is your depth. So the width you're not having to worry about in frame-wise. And it's a lot easier to move around than having a deep. Next, we're going to what's going to be considered the brood box, but what you're wanting, most beekeepers like to do in between that is have what's known as a queen excluder. What this is designed to do is exactly what the name means. This is designed to keep the queen from going up into, going up into your honey boxes. Because what can happen is if your queen decides to travel north and get into your honey boxes, any space that's available in there, she'll start laying eggs. So once she starts laying eggs in there and then you go to extract your honey, now you've got honey with a bunch of brood in it, become a real hassle for you because now you kind of got a real mess basically on your hands. So having one of these, it doesn't affect the worker bees at all. I mean, it's specifically designed, like I said, to exclude queens. It doesn't harm them. You'll see bees easily pass through it. I mean, you can actually observe it if you'd like. So it's a real handy tool to have. You just have to make sure that when you put it on, you want to make sure that it lines up evenly with your outside frame of your box. Because if not, your queen will find a way to slip through, and she will, like very readily. So if one of these bars end up getting bent a little bit wider, then it's basically useless as well because the queen will find a way to slip through all that space. So it's specifically designed to prevent her from doing that. But widening these, I mean, probably just about a millimeter or two, and she'll find her way through there, possibly. So this is just to completely remove the ability to do that. Next, we would get into the actual brood box here. So this is a deep, what's considered a deep. These are your largest boxes, basically. When it comes to the brood nest, that's where most of your activity is going to be taking place in your hive. This is where the queen's laying all of the new babies. This is where the workers are feeding all of the rest of the hive. This is where the new workers are being born. This is where the foragers are coming in from the entrance, and they're transferring to the nectar carriers that would take the nectar and bring it up back into the honey box. Basically, this is where most of your activity is occurring. So this is the area that most people are going to spend when they want to check to see how well their hive is doing. This is where you're going to be ending up, is inside this box, which is known as the brood nest. It's pretty standard. A healthy brood nest probably has around 5 to 7 frames of what's known as capped brood. That's a pretty good indicator of how well your hive's doing, especially during the spring. Anything less than that usually is an indicator that there might be a problem or there might be not enough food, different types of ailments and problems like that I can discuss, or we will discuss later on what to look for to see if they're receiving enough food into the hives. So after that, we get to the bottom of the boxes, which is basically just, here this one has a built-in feeder that it makes it real convenient if you guys supplement feed for your hive. You just remove a few frames, and this is a full gallon feeder. Tom was mentioning that a really good technique to do for this so you don't disturb your bees is basically to have all your feeders on one side, so you just have to slide the box slightly over. You don't have to actually pull the whole thing off, which will leave the disturbance to the bees to a minimum, which is a great technique to use because the more you disturb the bees, the more alert they're going to become to the situation. They're going to start thinking that their hive isn't suitable or protected enough to house that colony, which might cause them to basically what's known as absconding. Well, they will all just suddenly just take off and leave the hive, and they'll leave all the brood there. They'll take as much honey as they can, but they'll leave everything else behind. And it'll be almost no indication of it other than a completely empty box for no reason. So that's one method to ensure the feeding is kind of nice, is to be able to slide it over like that. On this box, he's actually got a frame hanger. So this can be helpful for people when you're going through the hive. I always recommend to come through the outside of the hive first because that's where you're most likely not to encounter the queen. Usually the queen likes to be more in the interior of the hive than the outside. So by starting off coming from the outside of the hive, you're less likely to squish her, basically, by using your hive tool or any other method. Plus, most of the outside frames are usually some type of food store as well. So you don't have to really worry about the brood as much on those as well. So once you have a few frames removed, it's kind of nice to be able to, it's real easy to work with the bees that are in here after that. And then we'll go further into that. And then here we have basically the bottom board, which is just the bottom of the hive. We don't have an example of a screen bottom board, which is basically just a bottom board, but it's made a screen on it as well, so you can allow mites to drop off through the screen, because once they drop off onto the hive, they can't crawl back up or crawl back into the hive. They're unable to do that. So that's one advantage of a screen bottom board. That's a whole nother different topic though. And then finally we have what, you know, this entrance reducer here. And what this is for is if you have, say, a weak hive, or if you have a hive that's getting robbed, you can put this type of product on it. And as you can see, instead of having this full basic opening for bees to come in and out of, now you only have this very small space. This one's extremely small. You probably should never get to that one compared to this larger size right here. And what that does is it does exactly what it's called. It's an entrance reducer. It allows less bees to be able to come in at once, so the guard bees can do their jobs more efficiently. So that's basically the breakdown of the Langstroth hive. You know, it's pretty simple in its design, but it's been around now for 160 years. So obviously the guy did it pretty well. You know, we haven't really deterred or changed very much from this at all. So discovering that bee gap space was a pretty intuitive thing that beekeepers have utilized now for, like I said, over 160 years. So it's pretty nice, pretty neat guy. Here we're going to go over the basic bee biology of what happens when a worker bee becomes a worker. So what happens is the queen will come in, and you'll see a queen when she's working. Like if you actually observe a queen, you'll see her checking it for empty cells. And when she gets to one, you'll see her with what's called her ovipositor, which is where she lays eggs. You'll see her literally stick her rear end in, and then she'll come out, and there'll be a perfectly laid egg that stands straight up in the cell, and it looks like a little grain of rice. And there should always be only one per cell. So that egg will be laid, and then 4 days later, it'll hatch into a larva. And once it's hatched into a larva, it basically starts emitting, you know, like pheromones, like saying, hey, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, I'm hungry. So here come nurse bees will come to it, and they'll start feeding it. The first 4 days is actually fed royal jelly, which is what the queen gets as well. But after that, the next 6 days out of the 10-day period that they're being fed, they get fed what's called worker jelly. It's not quite as highly nutritious as the royal jelly, but it's a combination of pollen and nectar that they're finding still. It's still highly nutritious. I mean, they basically double in size every day is what you're looking at. So from there, the larva gets sealed in from the comb on the outside, where it starts to also seal itself from the inside with its own web spinnerets. And that was at the 10-day period is when it's capped off. So we have a 4-day hatching period, and then you have basically a 6-day window of feeding. And on that 10th day, you'll see what's called cap brood, which if you've ever had a beehive, it's basically an orangish colored brood capping on the hives that's in the same shape as the hexagonal shape of the beehive. And from there, you're basically waiting another 11 days for the bee to hatch out. So 21 days is what the worker comes to be. Every 21 days is you'll have a new worker bee emerging from the cell. Of course, you want it to be a fully fledged worker. Sometimes there are some environmental conditions, or if the hive doesn't have enough nutrients, those adult bees don't always come out 100% fully formed. So that's kind of something that we want to try to prevent by seeing how the worker bees are feeding your larva. And that's something I'm going to describe later on, what you should look for in a hive to see if your bees are getting enough food to be able to properly feed all their larvae, so that way you're raising a hive properly. So here we'll go down to the next slide. So this is talking about the queen, the metamorphosis of the queen. Basically what this is showing is the queen takes the least amount of time to actually develop out of all the bees. Queens can be produced within 16 days, which is surprising since it's probably the largest bee out of the entire hive as well. But at the same time, it's probably one of the most important bees. So somehow in the mix of things during evolution, it's decided that it could be prepared faster than any other types of bees, which is shown here. So basically it's the same difference. A normal egg is used that the queen has laid, and then once the larva is hatched at day 4, it only is fed royal jelly for the rest of its time. So basically up to that 10-day mark, it's fed nothing but royal jelly. And what that does is it allows it to develop its ovaries and other internal organs at a higher rate than the typical worker bee would. And then it's capped off 10, and then it emerges days between 15 and 17, shown here. And then once it's actually released, what it'll do, if it has in the hive with other queen cells, it'll actually go to those queen cells and it'll kill all the other queens with its stinger. It'll go to each one. So that's something, if you do see queen cells in your hive, you probably want to remove them or check to see what's going on with your bee, because you guys are already coming with mated queens if usually and typically if you guys are getting packages or anything like that, like that's being offered by Menlovo, they have a mated queen. So if you already see queen cells in your hive, which if you haven't ever seen something like that before, they're typically on the bottom edge. They're a lot longer than a typical bee cell. You'll actually see them hanging there, and you'll actually want to remove those, because if not, then there's a possibility of another queen coming out. And if you have 2 queens in a hive, they might actually start fighting each other. And even if one survives, she can become hurt, and now all of a sudden your queen's hurt. The bees aren't going to like her as much. They might even kill her. And then you got to go through the whole 24-day cycle again of making another queen, which is probably too long of a duration without having any eggs laid, which could lead to basically your hive dying. So not to be off track, but after day 20, basically the queen will be mature enough. She will take off, and she will fly to what's called a drone congregation area, DCA, and she starts releasing pheromones. And these pheromones, the drones actually pick up on, and they fly to her, and then the queen can mate up with up to 80 drones. And that one mating flight should be her only mating flight. She has a storage organelle in her body that basically stores all the viable sperm that she gets from all those different drones, and that's what she's going to use for the rest of her life. So that's basically what happens with the queen to be able to start laying. So you're looking at about a 24-25-day period before you even have a queen coming and laying for you. But most of the time, most people nowadays just buy mated queens. But, if you ever want to advance in your beekeeping practices and try for yourself, to make queens, this is a kind of a real quick breakdown of what you're looking at. So that's basically a breakdown of the queen. So here is a good example of a queen bee here. You can see what I was talking about earlier, where she's kind of looking into the cell. And then can you guys see these little white dots here? Are you able to see those? So that's what the eggs look like. So once you start seeing these, see, she hasn't even checked these cells yet, so she's probably just working this area right here so far. And when you start seeing these eggs basically in the cells, you know that's a good, viable, mated queen. You know that she's doing her job. And another real easy way to find the queen is you can always see this circle of bees. See how they're all facing her? So this is her retinue. This is basically her guards and her attendants. They're all sitting there like, hey, what do you need? 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 And so she's sending signals to them through the different pheromone communicators. And basically they'll take those signals and they'll start distributing them throughout the entire hive. So that's an easy indicator of how to find a queen. And then, of course, an easy indicator, like I said, to know that your queen's laying is to find these little white eggs like these. So it's a pretty quick way or method to be like, hey, my hive's doing pretty well, or at least my queen is. So this is a drone bee here. Real easy way to tell of a drone bee is his larger eyes. Like his head's a lot bigger than your worker bee or your queen bee, for that matter of fact. Plus his antennas seem to be a lot more prominent in compared to the other honeybees. And there's a specific reason for that. So antennas have 170 different type of olfactory or smelling sensors in their antenna. So that's quite a bit of different smells that they can distinguish from. But there's one specifically that the queen releases, that the drone, it goes directly to his brain from the sensor. And that drone, that's all he's ever looking for. That drone bee wants to smell whatever that queen is, and he's like, oh my God, I need to fly there right now. Because other than that, a drone bee has zero purpose in a hive. It doesn't work, it doesn't clean anything, it doesn't guard anything. All it does is eat and wait to procreate. That's the only purpose of a male honeybee. So basically, during specific times of the year, if a male honeybee doesn't do its job, like doesn't end up mating, because the mating process does kill the male honeybee, but if it doesn't end up mating and it starts getting towards the winter, the female honeybees will literally kick the male honeybee out to die and starve. They're just basically like, oh, you didn't do your job, goodbye. You know, and it's pretty cruel, but that's what happens. So that's basically what a drone looks like. They're a fairly larger bee too. It's real easy to notice a drone. Sometimes people mistake them for a queen as well, but once you actually get a good look at it and you get used to seeing them, you just see it's a lot bigger bee, and its abdomen isn't quite as elongated as the queen. So, but it is really big and wide. Plus, their cells are a little bit bigger. Something that we're not going to get a whole lot into, but drones also are the favorite meal for mites. So when you're getting into the period that you notice that drones are starting to exist within your hive, you need to start worrying about mites, because that's typically the same around time of season that mites are going to start coming in, because drones take longer. They're the longest to develop. They take 24 days to develop instead of 21. So that gives the mites perfect period time of birthing cycle to be able to become fully mature mites. So that's something to kind of look out for if you're going to start doing beekeeping. Once, like I said, once the mites start, you should probably start looking for, once the drones start, you should probably start looking for mites. So here we have a normal life cycle of the honeybee. So honeybees typically live 42 days. That's supposed to be their lifespan. In a lot of commercial areas that we work in, just because of their working conditions, sometimes they die out between 30 and 35 days, which is something that we're all trying to alleviate, because that causes a huge shift in your roles. And that's what I'm going to discuss right here is basically your role changes. So from the first day until about day 4, when the bees come out, they're going to be a cleaning bee. So it's because they wake up, pop right out of the cell. They're kind of like, wow, where am I? I'm really, really, really hungry. I'm starving almost, because they've been locked in their cell for basically about 12 days. So they haven't eaten nothing. So the first thing that they do is they come to, usually on the corner of your hives where you see the brood, your normal brood, on all the corners you'll notice that it has some form of sugar, usually honey, basically stored in your corners. And so you'll watch the new bees, they'll come right to those corners and they'll start drinking that right away, just taking a real big gulp of it, because now they know that it's time for them to get to work. Because the moment they pop out, they're getting those chemical signatures from all the other bees coming from the queen going, hey, I need you to do this, I need you to do this, I need you to do this. So they start with cleaning the hive. And basically by cleaning the hive, that means removing any dead bees, removing any bee waste, removing any wax cappings that doesn't need to be there. Anything of that nature, that's all they're doing. They're just grooming the hive. Grooming the hive, they'll groom other bees. They'll just make sure basically everything's really, really clean. And that's because bees are a really, really clean insect. And that's a good thing, but also sometimes a problem when you're trying to treat things with like fungus and stuff like that. They'll readily remove the fungus out of the hive because they don't want it there. So after that, you'll get to what is called your nursing bee, which is between days 4 and 11. Nursing bees are a very, very vital role in your hive. They're what's deemed the social stomach of the hive, and by that I mean is they feed everybody. They feed the larvae, they feed the forage bees coming in, they feed the guard bees, they feed the queen, they distribute food to people because they have the highest levels of fats and proteins right then and there at that time, so their jellies that they're producing are the most nutritious. And that's actually what causes a role change down the line, or one of the factors, is actually as they lose those proteins and fats, it causes a shift in their DNA, and it causes them to do different role changes. So usually your really young nurse bees are going to be feeding your older larvae and other bees until they become trained well enough to feed basically newborn larvae, because newborn larvae are the most susceptible to disease at that moment because they don't have any natural innate bacteria in their system. That takes a couple of days for it to even exist, which is why there's a 3-day window for getting a disease such as like American foul brood, and that attacks the larva because they don't have any natural gut bacteria to be able to combat that. So after that, we get to three different stages between days 12 and, well, it seems 34 here. So we have the wax making, which is obviously a huge important role within the beehive. Wax is basically the foundation for everything. That's where they lay their eggs, that's where they store their honey, that's where they put their pollen. So wax is everything to a honeybee. Bees have 6 total glands. They're called mirror glands in their abdomen where they produce those waxes. And so they're at that stage in their life where they can consume sugar readily enough to be able to start producing those waxes. The ratio for wax to sugar, some say it's 7 to 1, so 7 pounds of sugar to 1 pound of wax. So you can imagine how much work it takes for them to be able to even produce the wax that you would typically find in one bottom box. So imagine when you got, honey supers that are, 5-6 high, so they're every 7 pounds. Some people say 15 pounds in some cases to 1. So there's still kind of a word out of what it actually is, but that's the range that you're actually looking for. The fanning here, what that basically is all honey is floral nectar. So what it does is you have to lower the water content in the honey in order to basically call it honey, or nectar. You have to lower the water content in the nectar in order to basically call it honey. So you have to lower it to below or at 18% water content. And once it's actually at that level, that's when it's considered honey. So you can imagine a bee just sitting there next to a cap and just sitting there with its wings just flapping it, and that's all it does. It'll just sit there and flap it until it can read by itself, like, hey, this has about 18% now. It's now considered honey. They'll cap it over and they'll move on to the next cell. So after that, we got nectar transfer. And basically what that is through a process called trophallaxis, which is regurgitating nectars between insects. The forage bees will come in that have been out foraging honey, and they'll go to these bees that are your nectar transfer bees, and they'll literally come up and they'll stick their tongue basically down their throat into their honey crop and suck all the honey out. And then after they do that, they'll go to wherever the storage locations during that time is, and they'll put it in the cell, and then of course that's when the fanner comes on and he starts fanning it, and then you get the guy and they cap it up. And that's basically the next stage, or your third stage of the worker bee's life. From there you get to a guard bee. Usually those guys are the ones that have probably really spent a lot of their lipids and proteins, so they shift real fast into a guard bee. Instead of being, as you can see, the wax making is a little bit longer of a duration. That's because they have to consume a lot of sugar. Guard bees are there for one purpose, which is pretty obvious, is to guard the hive. So they're checking through the entrance all of the different bees that are coming in. They're checking to see if, hey, does this bee belong here? Does this bee belong here? This bee belong here? So typically, most hives of about 60,000 can have anywhere from 600 to 1,000 guards, which is, quite a bit, since it only takes about 200 bee stings within 2 minutes to kill a person. So a hive does have, a sufficient number of bees to be able to knock you out. But that's basically the only role of the guard bee, is to prevent unwanted bees and pests in your hive. So important job, but this probably is the most important, well, I wouldn't say most important, but probably even more dangerous than being a guard bee is the final shift where they go into a forage bee. Now, when this happens, their brain actually increases in size by 3 times. Now, the reasons why they think that that happens is because they have to actually have spatial memory and remember where locations are, be able to tell other bees where locations are. So that's why they think that they have their brain goes up in size so much, because now they have to actually know where they're at. They also are the most exposed to the elements because they're actually leaving the safety of the hive. So you have more disease that might come in from them, you have more pests that might come in from them, and then also you have predators that might attack them as well. So they're the most likely to probably get hurt or die off, and their whole job is just to find food. So find food, or if the hive is thinking about swarming, to find a new suitable location to be able to basically start a new colony. So that's what their main job is from there. So that's your typical breakdown of the roles of a worker bee. It's actually pretty complex, but simple at the same time for just one bee to be able to accomplish all of these different roles within a hive. And all it really matters on is basically a pheromone signal and the levels of what's known as vitellogenin in their bodies, and that's actually what causes the role shift. But there's not really a whole lot of reason to go into that. So this, this is a repeat. So this is a setting up the bee yard. What this is basically talking about is what type of conditions that you want in your bee yard in order to have a good bee yard to support your bees. The first thing is obviously a water source. Everything living pretty much needs water. Same with bees. So you want to have a fairly fresh water source anywhere that you have a bee colony at. It'll prevent them from going some location that of a non-bee friendly area, like maybe your neighbors, as it says here, their pool. They probably wouldn't enjoy that too much, having a bunch of bees flying in and out of their pool while they're trying to swim. I don't think I would either, but plus you know what the bees are drinking at the same time, because some water sources can be contaminated, and that can lead to a slow decline in your beehives, which is what you're not looking for. Another thing, if they are visiting pools, even though that you have a fresh water source out, that probably means that they're looking for mineral salts, because there's also obviously chlorides in a pool for the chlorine. So if you do notice, or you hear anybody saying like, oh, your bees keep coming to my pool, and you know that you have a fresh water source out, most likely it's because they're looking for mineral salts. So you can actually have a separate source full of mineral salts of calcium, potassium, chloride, anything like that, and sodium chloride, so that way they can readily get those minerals that they're lacking, obviously, and that's why they're visiting different water sources than you're providing. So after that, we're looking for flight path. So obviously flight path is going to be coming out of the front of your hive. The reasons why you want to ensure that it's not a location that's being crossed a lot is because the bees can get angered by it and disrupted by it, because they're going to be flying in basically extremely fast. They're not even caring what's going on around them. They just want to get home, come back out, go home, come back out, get home, come back out. And the more interactions that they have with different environmental factors, the more problems that you're going to run into. So you basically want to ensure that their flight path is away from, like, say, your neighbor's front door, because then they're going to be flying towards their neighbor. Or you want to ensure that it's not anywhere, like if you have pets and you see that they're running around a lot in a certain area, you want to try and avoid that as well. Because, I know that my dog likes to eat flies and things like that, so I don't think it would prevent him to try and eat a bunch of bees, which wouldn't be the best thing for him. So that's something that you want to take in consideration. Another thing is obviously seasons and weather. What really helps with that is to, once again, go to your local beekeepers. They're going to have a really good knowledge of, like, hey, during this time of year, this is what it's like. During this time of year, this is what it's like. And that they're going to be able to give you a lot of good information about, especially with flower patterns, floral patterns, way the sun is, when rain hits. So you want to be pretty aware of that. Bees like to have a good source of morning sun compared to afternoon sun. So in the afternoon, they prefer a little bit cooler climate, late afternoon. And then in the morning, they like to wake up, be nice and warm, start getting through a day of work. So then, of course, the general working conditions. The reasons why that this is pretty important is because obviously you don't want to come from the front of a hive to start working on the hive. That's where all the guard bees are. You're going to agitate them, especially when you open the box up. Now they're going to be really, like, whoa, what's going on here? Something just tore my hive open, my home open, and they're just going to engulf you. They're going to start coming at you. So it's a lot easier to come from the side of your hives. Side of your hives is you're already facing the way that the frames naturally go in as well into your bee box. So it's just an easier way to work with your bees. And at the same time, you want to make sure to have a smoker ready. I mean, at pretty much any time that you're working with bees, you want to make sure to have somewhere a smoker ready, because that will instantly, if they ever start getting really, really aggressive to you, start hearing that hum in a beehive that they just get riled up. It's real easy to just give them a couple of shots of smoke, and then you'll just hear them just all of a sudden calm down. And the hum sounds different because you can hear them actually fanning the hive out to get rid of the smoke. So you'll get used to that more. That once you work bees more, you'll start noticing kind of like the different sounds of their wings, and you'll start being like, oh, okay, now I know that they're calming down, or now you'll be like, oh God, I need to throw the lid back on real quick and kind of not mess with them. So that's basically working considerations, why you want to come to the side of the hive. Anyway, so we'll go to the next slide. So this is basically showing here some different directions, kind of like an indicator of what we were talking about earlier. Let's say this is your house. This is indicative of a water source and floral source. So your bees are probably going to most likely, this is the flight pattern, going to be traveling this way. But see, you can tell that these boxes aren't in location, but this is the way that they're probably going to be flying. Same thing with this. This is probably what you don't exactly want a flight pattern as, because the bees are flying directly towards your neighbor's house. You're probably not going to really enjoy hearing from your neighbor, them being attacked by bees all the time. Who knows what might happen from that? So I don't know what your local regulations are for beekeeping, but it's just common courtesy to kind of try and prevent that, because even though as lovely bees are, nobody likes to get stung very much. It's just not a fun thing to happen. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide from there. So this is just, we're kind of going to go over basic management and what I was talking about earlier, what you want to look at in your beehive when you're actually looking into the hive to be like, hey, my bees are being fed right, maybe some different smells that could be indicative of disease, and maybe some physical looks on what your bees are doing that can also be indicative of some different types of viruses and such. So that's stuff that we can go over to that. So this is basically what you should wear in beekeeping. Something like this, you want a light colored suit. For some reason, bees have more trouble seeing dark items, and it's probably because of the range of colors that they can see. So they kind of get worried about it, and they almost go into an automatic attack mode when they see something dark. So you want to stick with a light colored suit, similar to this. Some people prefer what are known as half suits. It's just basically a top jacket and a veil. That's a little easier to wear. You don't have to pull it on and off. It really depends on how you feel, on how your hives are acting too, because obviously a half suit, your legs are going to be exposed. But if you wear some pretty tight cuff jeans and some nice boots, you can avoid that with a half suit too. But I still wear a full suit most of the time. Just because I'm just used to it. So it's easier for me to pull it on and off. But that's a pretty prime example of it. We got a smoker, which is probably one of the beekeeper's best friends. It's just simple, a bellows smoker. What you like to usually fill this with is like some type of burlap or hemp. And you light it on fire, but you don't let it burn. You let it smolder. So once it seems like it has a pretty good burn on it, you just stuff it in here, you close it up, and you should have a fairly decent amount of smoke at first, kind of popping up. If not, just kind of give it a few puffs, and you'll start seeing the smoke actually being dispersed as it should. It'll start shooting out in a large stream. Then you can, then it's basically ready to use. You can sit it to the side. It shouldn't go out depending on how much burlap that you have in there. And it's an easy way to check to see if it's ready. You just come over and basically push on it a couple of times again, and some more smoke will shoot out, and then you know that your smoker's ready. Some people like to use sugar water in a spray bottle to calm down their bees, which is also another pretty good method, because what that does is it entices the bees to start grooming themselves. Because like I said, bees are a highly clean or an insect, so they'll completely stop what they're doing, and you'll see them start licking everything. Their tongue will just pop out, and you'll just see them licking everything, which is also kind of neat to watch anyway. So that's something else that you could always do. The next one was we go to the hive tool, which is probably pretty universal. There's one other different type of hive tool that kind of looks like an axe on the side, but I don't know. I haven't had a lot of time using that one, so I've always gone with this type of standard hive tool, which I believe you can get in the Melovo hive kit, which is actually has a lot of the basics that you need. The smoker, the hive tool. Bee brush is basically to move bees off of either honey or a frame that you're trying to work with, and you don't want to really hurt the bees. It's real gentle with them. It's not like you sit there and slap them off, though. It's just a kind of a real light brush on the bees, and you'll see them kind of move out of the way, especially if you're looking for eggs or something like that. You don't really want to brush if the queen's on there, though. That's the kind of last bee you want to ever, if you can, interact with too much. So, and then after that, we got it's a hive or a frame remover. It's pretty simple to use. It's an easy way to pull frames in and out. It's pretty handy to have on there as well. So all that comes in this kit, which is it's pretty nice. It's a pretty nice kit to have. It also comes with this this frame hanger here, which can be real convenient to do. If you only have one hive, especially, or two hives, you don't plan on moving a lot. Usually, you set the frames down onto the side of the hive, which sometimes can cause bees to crawl out onto the ground or whatnot. With this, it's just real easy to hang them onto the side. You can leave it on if you want, or not. It just really depends on you on what you want to do with that, and depending on how you work, basically. So then obviously on C, like how we were discussing, using the smoker for the guard bees. If you really start seeing the bees get really wild, you want to add smoke, because that's going to lessen the amount of bees that actually get killed. And then, of course, the more bees that sting you, the more alarm pheromone going off, which means more bees are going to get excited, and it's kind of a tumbling snowball kind of effect. So this is actually showing here what a standard package looks like offered by Melovo, which is they're supposed to be ordered right now, because there's a limited amount of time that you can actually order them. And plus, there's probably a limited supply at a point. This is just your normal package box. It's just a wooden box with some netting around the side. You can't really see it, but in here is this, which is your queen bee. So she's actually probably somewhere in here, around here, where this giant cluster of bees is, because all those bees right now, their only purpose really is to keep her alive, because there's no eggs, so there's no larvae for them to take care of. The only thing they want to do is make sure that queen lives, and they want to find somewhere to live, like as soon as possible. That's all that's going in their head right now. It's like, hey, man, I can't wait till I can start working and feeding these babies and keeping this queen happy. So that's basically what your standard 3-pound package looks like from Melovo, which is, I mean, it's a beautiful thing. This is kind of an easier breakdown, excuse me, of what the package looks like without everything in it. All the bees. This is the package here itself. This is the sugar syrup that's sustaining the bees while it's in there. And this is the queen cage that's going to hold your mated queen, which is going to basically be the heart of your hive. So it's a real simple box, nothing too complicated, but at the same time it covers everything that you need. So this is going to discuss basically what you're going to want to be doing when you first start your packages. As I was talking about before, bees, they need somewhere to lay, and that takes a lot of wax. So you have to make sure that you're keeping whatever source of nectar that you're using at first. If it's pure honey, the better, because that's a lot of different types of sugars. If you're using sugar water, it's probably better to do a 50-50 type of sugar water, which is 1 pound of sugar to every 1 pound of water. That's going to give them what they're looking for not only to produce wax, but also keep those bees really going, keep their energy levels up, because it's shown that a bee will eat 11 milligrams of sugar a day or 22 microliters of sugar a day, which is, it's quite a bit. And you can understand why, because of the amount of work that they do. I mean, they're working 24 hours a day. They need that sugar to keep them boosted, to keep them going. So when you first get the package, you want to make sure that you're giving them proper amount of sugar. After that, you're going to want to check the hive again to look for those eggs, those rice-sized eggs. So when you first start putting the bees in, all of the bees that are in the package are about 5 to 30 days old. So bees' natural lifetime is 42 days. So basically you've got, around a few weeks, about 3 weeks, to get new brood started. And if that doesn't happen, then basically your hive will die off. And it's because they have no more workers. All the workers are too old to feed the bees. They don't have the proper amount of nutrients in their jellies anymore, or they just don't have the energy to do it. And then, or their body's literally deteriorating to the point that they can't do it. So you want to make sure to stimulate the wax, and then you want to come back after you release the queen, maybe 2-3 days later. I would say 3, just so you kind of let her kind of settle in. You want to check for those eggs into that hive after you got it started. If you see eggs there, it's perfect. Don't come back to that hive for, I'd say, another 2 weeks, because that's going to give them a time to cap those eggs, start laying other eggs, get more comfortable in their living space. So that's something you're going to look for. And then right here it says if you're not producing what you'll need to requeen within the first 2 weeks. So if you come back after you first release your queen and in 10 days you don't see any eggs at all, then most likely you need to get a mated queen, like right now, because you've got to come back, put that queen in, and hope that she's going to start laying within a few days. Or basically your whole hive is going to run out of workers, and then it's going to get so small in the amount of bees, it's going to be really, really difficult for them to even take care of proper amount of bees for it to come back to a sustainable level. So that's another important part. You want to keep your inspections at the beginning kind of limited, because those bees just moved into that house, basically. So they want to become comfortable with it. They want to spread their pheromones around. They want to propolize it and seal it off. They basically want to make it theirs. So if they keep having somebody, come through it and be like, oh, wow, check this out, and they're shaking it around, and, you keep going through it, and you just keep playing with it, it agitates them. And at the same time, if they have eggs laid on it, you can move those eggs around, or you can shake the larva sometimes, and then that larva won't become a fully fledged bee, because maybe if you shook it too much, it knocked its head on something. And now when it starts to develop, that part of its head is still damaged. So now it comes out, it's like a 86% produced adult bee. Maybe one of its wings doesn't work right or something like that, which causes the entire hive to kind of decline slightly. So that's the reason why you want to kind of, in the very beginning, limit yourself to probably visiting your hive every couple of weeks and actually opening it up and looking into it at most. So this here is talking about when we're going into the summer nectar flow, what to look for. Here you can see bees bearding. Most likely this is from either extremely hot conditions, because they're inside the hive. If all the bees are inside the hive core temperature would be too warm for them to be able to even sustain themselves, or there's not enough room. So you see bees bearding like this, probably because they're also about ready to swarm. There's that possibility as well. So what you might want to do is either add another brood box, so that way it gives the queen more area to move into and lay, and also allows for more bees to move up. With heat stress, it's the same difference. You can sometimes see a bee's beard like this. What you want to do is just make sure they have plenty of water. You got to make sure there's plenty of good fresh water source, and that will help prevent you from having heat death. Buildup of comb in population, that's basically the same thing, what I was discussing. You'll start seeing bee beards. You might even see, like I was talking about, queen cells forming on the ridge, which is basically what they'll do is they're typically going to be around here in this area, or they'll be down here at the bottom, and you'll see them. They're a cell that's about this long, and there'll be like 5 or 6 of them, like, just kind of placed. And if you start seeing that and your queen is still in the hive and she's laying eggs, that hive's about to swarm. So usually the easiest way to get rid of that is to kill all the queen cells or just scrape them off with your hive tool and then just add another brood box. Because then that queen's like, oh, I've got more space to lay eggs. Okay, this hive's good enough for me. We don't need to split. So, or you can do a split yourself, which is not discussed on this, but it's basically you divide your own hive into half, and then eventually you come back to it, you find which hive has the queen in it, which is of course by looking for the eggs, and then you add a new mated queen to your other box, and then bam, now your one hive became two, and then hopefully you'll have enough time for both of those hives to build up properly, and then you'll have two hives instead of one. So that's basically what supering is what I just discussed for adding a new brood box to prevent your hive from swarming. Requeening, we're going to basically discuss what you're looking for that. So obviously this side, this is what your cap brood looks like, right? So this is a really good example of what cap brood looks like. You want it to be real fluffy like this, kind of like a marshmallow, because that's indicative that the bees were fed really, really well. If you see them like this, they're kind of flat, they're real sporadic. It means that hive is probably not getting enough nutrients, plus at the same time the queens might get older, she's not laying as well, or maybe when she first got mated, she didn't get mated real well. So you start seeing sporadic, like just spots, kind of, we call it shotgun pattern brood. And that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for something like this. Like these normal holes right here, this is just where fresh bees have just been born that day. So that's typically not that big of a deal. But if you start seeing stuff like this, then you've got to start worrying about the quality of your queen. So you got to start being like, oh, maybe I should look a little deeper into that. So when you're looking into your hive and you see most of your frames look like that, you probably, if you are going to want to requeen. If it's really, really late in the year, you might want to wait till next spring, just because she's probably going to stop laying in a little while anyway. So you don't want to waste the money and actually get a new queen if it's not going to be helpful anyway. So, but also another indicator of what I was talking about is when you sit there and see the larva inside the cell, you should see a milky white substance inside that cell with that bee. And what that is the actual jellies that are being fed that larval bee. And that larva should be basically covered by half its body width of with that jelly. So if you see that, excuse me, consistently throughout the hive, then you know that that's being fed properly. And that's what you're kind of wanting to look for. And then the worker patterns, how many frames are covered. So what that means is basically how many frames of bees do you have? Like you can usually tell from the top how many frames you have, depending on what the weather's like. Like if it's fairly warm, they'll usually swarm over the top bars. But if not, they'll stay basically within the frame of the hive, and you'll want to see 50–75% of the frame covered on both sides. And you'll be like, okay, that's one frame of bees. So a typical good hive during like midday, because obviously half the bees are gone as a workforce, you want to see about 7–8 frames of bees in your hive. And that's a really good indication, like, wow, that's a really, really good hive. Usually, you want 5 to 7 frames of brood at the same time, because you kind of want an equivalent, how many bees that are working or how many bees being born. That way you don't have, a slow decline in your hive. So after that, you're going to be looking at, I already talked about the brood pattern, right? After that, we're going to be looking at food stores, honey, and pollen. Pollen, you'll look in depending on what your floral sources are. Most of them are going to be an orange or a yellow. You'll actually see it packed into the frame. You'll see like these really dense orange or yellow colors just all over the place. And that'll be your pollen source. You probably want a good 3–4 frames of pollen, depending on what time of year it is. If it's during the spring, you want more pollen, because actually protein is more important than sugar while they're making babies, because protein is what builds everything. Everybody's made out of protein. So the more protein you have, the more higher quality jellies that you have. So if you see a lot of really good floral sources in there, you see just frames and frames of pollen, you're probably doing pretty well. But you need the sugars too. So you want to see how well they're doing with honey. See if if they have a good source of honey. You should see four frames of honey, nice solid capped honey. And you can tell which honey frames are because they're really, really heavy. They're usually 5 to 7 pounds a frame, so they're usually fairly heavy. They'll have at the same time really nice white cap comb over it because it's a freshly capped frame. So that's kind of what you're looking for to establish that beehive's doing well. You're looking for the brood patterns, which is probably a huge indicator. And then you're looking for the larva inside, how much of those jellies is actually being fed to it. And then you're looking at your food stores. So any one of those can be an indicator that something's wrong. If one of those is missing, then there's probably something that you need to work on differently during that time to be able to prevent stuff like this from happening. So eggs. So as I was showing you the little rice dots, I don't think there's many on here that we can see, but you can actually see the larva here being formed, and you can see how large they get and how quickly right here. So eggs are a real good indicator of how well the queen's doing. Actually, you can see a couple eggs right down in here, but it's a real good indicator to see how your hive's doing. The queen can lay every day 1,500 to 2,000 eggs, which is quite a few. So your population is increasing every day by 15 to 2,000 bees. At the same time, the egg laying is also a good indicator of how well your queen's doing. If the queen should always lay 1 egg per 1 cell. There's no difference. There should never be, like maybe you'll see once in a while, like once in a great while, 2 eggs per cell. Like you should never see that. If you do once, like every 1,500 cells, it's not a real big deal. But if you start seeing like 3, 5 eggs, 6 eggs, 2 eggs, 3 eggs in 1 cell, then you know that the queen has lost her ability to be able to tell that there's an egg in that cell. And she'll just start laying eggs and she'll be like, okay, that's good enough. And of course, those can't develop into a bee because the cell size is perfectly formed for 1 adult bee to develop. So if you have that many eggs in there that you know that your queen's gone bad, you need to replace her as soon as possible. So that's a really good indicator as well as how well your queen's doing. So honey harvest is the next part. It's a kind of a fun process. It can be really sticky sometimes. Really depends on what you're going to do. That's where it helps to get your local guys again. If you don't feel like doing it yourself, some local guys could be a commercial guy, or they might have a service where they'll uncap it and they'll bottle it for you. They'll actually stream the honey out for you. Or a commercial guy might run the whole thing for you. It really depends. They might charge you just honey, or they might charge you a cost. So it really depends on what you feel like doing. The process isn't really that bad. You get what's known as a hot knife, and you extract the honey. There's a few different methods to do to remove the bees from your honey supers. There's a few different type of chemical adjuncts that you can add. One of them is called BeGo, and you basically would take the interior lid like this, not of course the one from a hive, but something similar, and you would staple some burlap bags on it, and you would squeeze this juice. It's called BeGo, and it's horrible smells. It smells terrible, and you just stick it on the top of the hive, and it causes all the bees to run down to the bottom of the hive. You'll literally see the bees beard out from the bottom of the hive, and then you just remove the honey. You take the honey off, and then you want to make sure that you put your honey somewhere that the bees can't get to it again. So you want to put it in a really tall stack. Make sure you have a bottom board that doesn't have an entrance. You want to stick your supers on that, and you want to seal them because the bees will go to it immediately. Because right then all of a sudden they see like, oh man, there's the mother load. Like if you've got like 4 or 5 supers of honey, suddenly there's like 200 pounds of honey just sitting there, and there's no bees on it because now the smell's completely gone because you washed it out with the BeGo. All the bees are going to want to go to that. And you do not want your bees to start getting that robbing sensation in your yard, especially if you have more than 1 hive. Because if they start getting that sensation and then they can't get to that honey, they'll go to the weakest hive and they'll start trying to kill that hive and steal their stuff. Because they're like, oh man, I really wanted this food and I know it's there, but let's go to them instead. And you'll see all the bees start congregating on this 1 hive, which is really, really hard to stop other than with a reducer, and you just have to really smoke it. But you'd prefer that not to happen. And the way to do that is when you're doing your honey harvest is to make sure everything stays inside, or to make sure that it's in a different location from where your bee yard is, to not leave honey-covered tools out, things like that. So after that, the process is pretty easy. You take what's known as a hot knife, and you just basically scrape the front cappings of the comb off. You can actually save those cappings. There's a lot of guys that actually will buy them from you. Like I said, go to your local beekeeping sources again. They're going to help you find stuff like that. You put it into an extractor, which is something similar to this, and you just basically spin it. And it's easier to extract honey in hot weather because honey's obviously on a more liquid state than when it's colder. So you just through our centrifuge, centrifugal force, the honey basically flies out, and you get your end product here at the end. It's not really, it can be time consuming, but it's kind of fun too. It's a fun activity to do with a couple of people because you usually get gunk on you, get sticky, and you laugh, or you forget to do something, and it just makes the whole process kind of fun. So, and plus the reward is pretty sweet too. So it's kind of nice. So basically, that's what to watch for on honey harvest is that the bees, like I was talking about, the weak hives will be attacked and robbed. So you want to reduce your entrance to prevent that, because your weakest hives, they're lacking what's called queen mandibular pheromone, and that's shown what's one of the attractants to other bees when they fly by it. They're like, oh wow, there's not a lot of QMP in here. They probably don't have that many bees. Maybe we should go in there and steal all their stuff. So that's what one thing you want to try and prevent with the entrance reducer. When you watch the buildup of honey, what that means is you want to make sure that your bees always have empty comb. If a hive ever gets to the point where everything's full, like that queen has absolutely nowhere to lay, the workers have nowhere to store honey, they're like, oh, it's time to go to another place, we need to split in half, it could cause swarming, things like that. So that's what you want to prevent, which if you're checking your hives every 2-3 weeks, you should be able to readily tell that's happening, unless like with a huge honey flow, like if you noticed like 2 weeks ago, like the bees are just working super hard, and they're just bringing in honey. Frames are just filling up 8-9 frames. You should probably add another super anyway, just to be sure, so you cover that honey flow so they don't become what's known as honey bound, which is there's no more room for anything, which is when they start getting kind of agitated, which is what you don't want to do. And then, as we were discussing, you want to keep your equipment clean. You want to make sure that there's no residue of honey on anything. You want to make sure there's not like a clumps of, uncapped wax that's covered in honey on anywhere, just kind of sitting around, because that's going to stimulate the bees as well to get into that robbing frenzy. So you want to make sure to prevent that. So it's just kind of like keeping on top of yourself of where your tools are, where your honey is, and then of course cleaning it. So now that's actually basically the breakdown of the honey. Now I'm going into what I'm introducing here with you guys is the product called AppyCare. It's been on the commercial market for about 6 years now, and what this is it's a 100% natural deterrent for any type of viral diseases that you come across, any type of bacterial diseases such as American foul brood, European foul brood, chalk brood, nosema. This is designed to prevent that from happening. This is actually designed as a preventative, while at the same time it increases the beneficial gut microbes that are in the bee. So we'll get a little bit further into that right now. So this right here is a real simple breakdown of kind of like the internal structure of your bee right here. So you're starting with, the mandible, and this is coming into the mouth, and this is going into its first gut, and then you're getting into the hind gut here, and then of course the rectum. So this is where a lot of the bacteria exist, is basically in this area within your hind gut and your mid gut. And that's also where a lot of your diseases are coming from, a lot of your viral diseases, a lot of your fungal diseases. So this product is designed to prevent that. So this is showing how viruses interact with normal tissue, and basically they convince the host tissue to absorb the virus and then that way it can go in there and reproduce itself using the natural organelles or anatomy of that cell to make basically a factory for itself. So ApiCare prevents this from even happening by making a protective layer in the bee's system throughout its digestive tissue. So by having this protective layer in its digestive tissue, it doesn't allow the virus to even interact with any of the healthy tissue that beehives, which lowers the amount of work that the natural bee's immune system has to do, because the immune system in the bee is the most energy-consuming system of the honeybee. So that's going to cause their role changes, those 7 roles that we basically went over, that's going to cause them to become those roles quicker than they should. And once you start down that road, it causes your bees to basically decline at a very, very high rate. So you want to kind of prevent that from happening. That's what this is for. We'll go in here. This is basically another part of what the product does. This is showing what is known as the malphagian tubules of the bee. This is towards the rectum and hindgut. And what these basically are for the bee is their kidneys. This is kind of what's filtering out their hemolymph or their blood. This is trying to pull out any type of free radicals that could be sitting there and basically pulling apart different tissues that they need throughout their body. It helps to control electrolytes in their system as well. And it also helps to scavenge sodium, potassium, things like that the bee actually requires to communicate with itself. So what the ApiCare does is it kind of adds to that as well. It has an antioxidant in here. So the bees don't have to, once again, use their own energy in order to combat those free radicals by making superoxidative dismutase and things like that, and the cytochromes that the bees naturally possess. But when they have to activate those systems, it causes, once again, those protein and fat levels in their bodies to lower. So by supplementing that with something like this, you're causing that bee to just focus on its one goal, and that's make a stronger hive. That's to feed those fats and those proteins to the upcoming young, or to the worker bees, or to the queen bee, to keep the hive at a nice steady growth level. So this right here, this is kind of just the microbes that exist within the bee. This here is a electron scanning microscope of what I have actually in ApiCare. And as you can see, it's a really porous material. So what this actually does, I call them like little hotels, is the bacteria from the bee gut actually go inside this and they start propagating at a high rate. So what that actually does is it stimulates the ability for the bees to digest food, because bacteria is one of the precursors for bees to be able to digest pollen, for them to be able to absorb amino acids. If they don't have those gut bacteria in there, they're actually losing the nutritional value of their food. So by stimulating a location for the bacteria to be able to develop within their gut, I'm increasing the amount of nutrients that the bees are absorbing through the food supplements that they're getting, while at the same time it's preventing all of these diseases from happening. So that's a pretty good beneficial element to add into it. Plus it's all natural. So that's a real big factor as well. You don't have to worry about if you consume it. You don't have to worry about if you get it on you. If you get it on anything, basically. It's 100% organic, and it prevents a wide range of diseases. So this is more of a concern for commercial beekeepers here. This is kind of a average loss of beekeepers is 33%. So this is a real quick breakdown of cost per hive of using the ApiCare product. We don't really have to get into this. You guys aren't probably going into the almonds with 1,000 beehives, looking for next year to bring maybe 1,500 beehives. But this is basically showing you that this can increase your profit potential by using the ApiCare product by quite amount. This is the average loss of having bees just for the almonds. 132,000 just out of 1,000, so 330, and then to treat 1,000 hives with ApiCare is 6,500. So it's kind of showing you you could spend about $6,500 a year, or you can risk losing 133,000. So it kind of gives them a gist of what's going on with that. Well, it looks like that was the last slide there. Is there any questions for anything? Or Tom, would you like to?
I was just gonna, we'll go to questions on that too, but the Applicare is gonna point out it's gonna be retailing about $65, so that can relate to you guys on the same thing. For $65 for 6 months worth of treatment, you're gonna get the same benefit when you're getting, average cost to get into doing your bees about $600, $500 to $600 depending on sales and stuff, so it's worth the benefit of running it.
And plus, it's real easy to apply. Actually, I can give an example real quick. So this is what you're typically looking at for a month application. So what it is thanks for reminding me. What it is basically you just open it. It's real simple. It comes with these pills that are basically activators for the bacteria. The reason why that had to occur is because if you leave bacteria in an environment that they're alive and they only have a very limited food source, eventually they'll start eating each other. So I wanted to prevent that from happening, so it became a binary system. So you basically just open this up and you just have to take this little pill and you just pop it open and you just pour it in. Oh, I don't want to spill it. And then I like to wait about 5 minutes to allow the bacteria to wake up from after introducing this. Just give it a kind of a nice little shake. And so what you're going to want to do is wherever your main brood cluster is on your hives, you're going to want to pop this open and you want to distribute half of it for the first half of your month, right? So with like how we were discussing with the package bees, like it would be real good like when you first initially put in your package and you come back the third day, that would be a good time to put the first application of this on because it also causes lower stress. So your bees are going to be less stressful as well. So you basically take this and you spray it. I'm not going to do it to this because it'll make a real mess, but you spray about, generally half of it. Just real good quick squirt all over the top of it. And you'll see the bees just come right to it and they'll start licking it up. And then you just come back, when you come back for your second check, when you come back for, to see if there's eggs and see if your queen's doing well, that's when you can put your second half of application on. And it's a real easy indicator, too, of when to come back and check for your hive, because this is supposed to be applied about every 15 days, 15, 17 days. So it's a real easy indicator to be like, oh, it's time for me to come back and check my hive. And so then you can come back and you spray the other half onto that. So there's enough through this package for a 6-month supply because typical bee time, you're probably only going to be working your bees about 6-7 months out of the year anyway, depending on weather conditions. So that it makes it a real simple process to help keep your bees alive. And we have, like I said, I've been working in the commercial world about 5-6 years, and thanks to Tom in Malovo, where I'm able to introduce it to the hobby world because I've got testing through Bee Informed Partnership, Beltsville Bee Lab, USDA, things like that, showing the effectability of this product in case that anybody wants to look further into it. I have evidence of showing that it's not just chocolate-colored water. So, but yeah, anyway, I thank you for listening to me up here for a little while and trying to teach you guys a little bit about beekeeping. And the one word of advice that I will give outside of that is if you ever hear a beekeeper tell you that he knows everything about bees, you have to run away because there's not a beekeeper alive that knows everything about bees. So if you hear someone say that, just be like, okay, thank you. And I'd probably recommend not talking to him. Anyway, if it is from Coastal.
I'll do some more and then I'll turn it over to you real fast. So, Coastal has a full line of beekeeping equipment for sale. They talked about a little bit about packages that are coming in. Packages, if you're going to be looking for them this year, they're going for $129.99. There's been a shortage on packages in years. This year's another rough year. You heard about the fires in California. That's bee country. You had the hurricanes back east. So it's essential for you guys, if you're going to get started, just to get your packages ordered right now. You do pre-sales. They'll be delivered around April 8th to April 15th is when they're going to be coming in. But if you're going to do it, you're going to want to do it now and get your order in as soon as possible so you can guarantee that you'll get your stuff. Like I said, Coastal carries a full line of beekeeping equipment all the way from protective gear to extraction equipment. by purchasing that through Coastal and you buy the Malivo, you're helping support Pam, which helps research that promotes stuff like this, what you're seeing with Apicare that comes out, different treatments and stuff for bees. We're gonna have a follow-up course to this. It's gonna be an extraction course and going into winter and more in depth than that. It's gonna be coming up in the fall. So everybody at home and you guys that are here, check into that, and we'll have live demonstrations and stuff on that for you, and keep in touch with Coastal in your stores for the dates that's going to be coming. Keep in touch on those social media pages that we lined you up with at the beginning to hear when the dates are going to be coming. And we get a lot of questions about mite treatments. So for varroa mites, this is something for our beekeepers that are out there that do it. So if you go to the Honeybee Health Coalition.org page, they have a whole bunch of training videos and stuff and recommendations on treatments to use. We're gonna have a whole line of treatments to use for varroa mite as well. That'll be available at Coastal coming out probably next month. It'll be here before your bees get in and before you're gonna be really treating for the season, so check back in. But the Honeybee Health Coalition, because we don't like endorse any one way because we're not that company with it. So I go with them, they're FDA approved, and they will steer you in the right direction on what to do with your mite treatments. And then without that, I think that's it, and we'll turn the time back over to Coastal. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with us on this Friday night. Do you guys have any questions here in person? And also, if there's any questions online, we definitely want to take time to address those while we are still live. We do carry a bunch of this stuff in our stores. We have some fun things to give away for people that are here in person. For everybody watching us live, we will be doing a special giveaway for you. So if you've been on here commenting, asking questions, letting us know that you're here, we are going to be picking one lucky winner to win a bee package out of our online watchers as well. So make sure as we answer questions here in person, everybody watching online, go ahead and type those questions in, ask them. That's your entry to win. So, questions? Yes, we already have one online one.
Are there benefits to having more than one hive or colony starting out, or is it best to just have one?
It's recommended to actually start with 2 hives. A lot of people will think that you're trying to do that, especially coming from us because we supply the equipment, but there's a reason why. So when Justin got in, he was talking about the brood production and having the eggs from one hive. If your queen starts to fail, if you lose your queen, you can kind of build and pull from one hive to the other, and it will help you boost that hive. And also, when you're going through it, you can kind of, when you're doing your inspections, you can judge from one hive to the other hive to see which one's going. If this one's really boosted and going really good, then you may have a problem with your other queen starting to fail or certain different issues that are going on. So it is recommended. You can't afford to have 2, but if you connect with somebody else from a bee club or somebody in your area, then you can kind of work with each other on that as well. So.
Yes?
Okay, so if I'm using a hive that's a few years old that used to have bees in it, they've all abandoned it, so I know that's kind of how you guys are dealing with. It's really dirty, and it has, the old remains, looks like there's still like wax, the wax is quite old. What's the best way to go about cleaning that?
The bees will clean it themselves. Like once you introduce new bees to it, they're a highly grooming type of insect. They'll clean out that whole hive within probably the first day or 2, depending on the amount of bees that you have. The typical package, that could actually be a little bit beneficial as long as you didn't see any type of disease inside that comb. Having that extra comb, that already fully formed comb, is going to allow that queen to have an area to lay already, which means that your hive's going to get started a little bit quicker, and they're not going to have to expel as much sugar energy to produce new wax. So
How would you know if there was a disease in it or something?
it's pretty hard to tell if you didn't know what was in it before. The only thing that I would say is if you don't see any wax moth, which you see a bunch of webbing around it or stuff like that, you're probably pretty good to go.
You want to make sure, so I'd recommend knowing where your equipment came from.
Yeah.
So if it's used equipment, but say you got it from a commercial beekeeper or your friend's just getting out of it, they lost their bees like these guys. If you guys knew there was no disease, they kind of got weak, they got robbed out, it was fine. But if you're just taking stuff that you found, you don't know where it came from, recommended probably not to use it because you could spread American foul brood in that. So know where it's coming from, and then it can be a benefit, like you're saying, to have that drawn comb and everything there. Because the main thing when you're getting into with hobbyists, when you're getting started, you know, everybody, 1 in every 3 bites of food comes from bees, pollination of bees, right? And there's a big push from commercial beekeepers because they worry about hobbyists getting involved because they worry about them spreading disease. So we want to practice good husbandry and make sure that we're doing everything in accordance to what we can do to make sure that we're not spreading diseases when we're going to put them in our backyard. So that would go into that. So, you know, you could take alcohol and stuff and wipe the box down. That's not going to cure, like American foul brood. If you have an outbreak of that, it's recommended that you burn your hives.
Yeah, because it's a spore-forming bacteria. So that, yeah.
Just know where your equipment comes from. Otherwise, it's recommended to start with new. So.
Okay. If you feed your hive, does that make them lazy?
No. So bees are not native to the United States. They're a European honeybee. We brought them over here. We've kind of evolved together. We've been keeping bees together for about 9,000 years, man and bee. So we've evolved together to live. But our seasons are different from here than in Europe. So even where I'm from, out of Utah, you know, I'm going to be not feeding you guys in 2 weeks. We'll start feeding some liquid feed and spurring up before a nectar flow comes on. So a lot of times we have to feed to stimulate that growth before a nectar flow comes on. And that's where we talk about beekeeping is inherently a local activity like gardening because you're going to have different seasonalities depending on where you're from. In Montana, we supply up there with some people, and they've got a foot of snow still. So it's all going to be a little bit different. Yep.
So we lost our bees last year too, but we have a ton of honey in the hive. We left it alone. Like we saw the remains of the bees because we had yellow jackets and wasps and things. Is it okay just to put the new ones in there? Because we did not dismantle it, take it apart or anything. We just closed it up.
Yeah, so the question was, we lost our bees last year and we still have resources of honey left over in that, and can we put, just install packets this year? And it'd be yes. As long as you knew that they weren't like foul brood or anything crazy that did it, then that's going to be a great resource for your bees to get started. So that's the main thing about using equipment from before, is just knowing where it came from. So, you got another one on mine?
Yeah, I got a bunch on mine. Okay, I want to place my hive near an apple orchard. How far away should it be, or should I place it directly in the orchard?
So it could go either or. The main thing that you're going to look at if you're doing apple orchards or putting around any commercial operations like that is make sure that you get a hold of the commercial producer to make sure when they're spraying. Because apples and all your commercial products are going to get sprayed, and you can buy or you can close your hive up if you let them know, if they let you know. So get in touch with them. You can close your hive up for a couple days, and if they applicate that right, then that's going to gas off and you'll be fine, and you can do it. So you don't have to, you can put it right in it. If you see the almonds, if you drive down California right now, you're seeing almonds by every tree, you know, so you can put them in it or in your yard. Bees will fly 5 miles from your hive, so it'll be good.
I don't know if this is important, but I know that, like obviously the bees are gathering nectar from a lot of different plants, right? Do you have to be aware of like the plant species that are around? For example, like I think foxglove it's poisonous for human, like maybe the nectar. Do you have to be aware of like the percent of plants that, I don't know, maybe could have effect in the honey? Like would that in turn affect the human consumption of it?
I don't think it has anything to do with the human consumption. So the question was the forage that's around that bees are going to be hitting, you have to worry about what's there. Now there is some commercial stuff where I know some commercial beekeepers that'll move it out because bees will hit it and they hit certain plants and they say, we don't want it because it can be kind of toxic to them, and they'll hit them and they'll move them out before the bloom. So I think that would just be more of an area thing to like what's in your area and what.
Going back to local beekeepers
Yeah,
again.
local beekeepers to know what's going on. But for the typical beekeeper in your backyard, you're not going to run into that problem.
Very rare.
Plenty.
Yeah.
Okay, how far away should a hive be from noise, like streets or a working farm? And we have chickens, do they pose a threat to the bees?
Well, I would say that you probably want to keep them the farthest away that you can from any noise sources, because that's just going to cause more of an annoyance to the bees. Chickens, I mean, they probably might try to pick a few out of the air, but I don't think it would be enough significant to cause a huge drought to your bees. I mean, because a typical hive, you've got 60,000 bees at any given moment, and I don't think that they were going to have, 5,000 chickens in their backyard to be able to eat that many bees that are flying out anyway. And plus the bees are going to be on a certain flight pattern. So that's going back to flight patterns again, like how we were discussing. You want to make sure that you're going to even avoid where those chickens normally forage at anyway, if you can. So it's going to go back to hive location, like how they're asking anyway. So yeah, probably the furthest away from noise that they can possibly get. And then of course, whatever their chicken coop is, make sure that their flight pattern isn't going to go across it.
That's it. So I know I worked with a biologist from the University of Utah that was a bee inspector, state bee inspector, and he kept his hives in his chicken coops. And he'd say, it's just a little bit of protein for my chickens, a little bit here and there. But the bees end up producing enough. What you're seeing, 1,500 to 2,000 eggs a day. They're usually, if your hive's strong enough, they'll be fine with that. As far as you're saying, noise is probably like you said, but I always recommend when you see the slide about hive location where you're putting it, I recommend just out of sight, out of mind, put them in your backyard, out of a well-trafficked area, so you don't have anything like kids kicking a soccer ball into it or anything. Just being responsible again with it. Bees are, they've been bred to be pretty docile. Certain times of the year they'll get a little bit more angry, but and when you're working them. But if you're getting in there, you just want to be a good steward to your neighbors and stuff, so they're not worried about it. A little bit of honey goes a long way with your neighbors too. So,
Yeah.
any other questions?
I have like 3 more questions. If that, you can go
I
ahead.
have
Yeah.
one last question. So the equipment that I'll be using was my brother's when he kept bees, but I think he said he had mite damage. Is there any way to prevent that, or can you still use equipment after it has been?
So varroa mite is what you're probably talking about with mite damage. The question was, can I still use it if it's been with had varroa in there before? Yes, because varroa has to have brood to live and to produce. So with that brood break where you don't have anything in there, you're not going to have any residue mites in there. So you'll be fine with that. And then that link that I talked about earlier, we'll go in and talk about treatments and stuff. Because I recommend there's a big different thing. You talk to different beekeepers. We recommend a treatment because you're
Twice a year.
you want to, and then if you see any problems with that, you want to preventatively treat, and then when you're checking it to see, because what you're doing is if you don't, you get a weak hive, and you have an issue like we talked about this at the beginning, where your hive's weak and other bees come and rob, you're spreading that disease, so you're spreading mites. So we recommend treatment. I don't, like I said, bees have evolved with us. Varroa mite is not native to here either. It's from, evolved. Yeah.
It's from Asia.
Yeah,
Most
came
likely.
from Asia. Varroa destructor, they call it. They came over either on boats or something when stuff's getting shipped in. It hit here, and it came in the 1980s. It was a big deal. Borders closed, and we've been ever since trying to fight against that. So it's a big deal.
On the varroa mites, I know I haven't had bees for about 10 years, but when I learned to keep 20 years ago, it was recommended to alternate your different varroa mite treatments so you didn't build up the immunity, or the varroa mites didn't build up immunity to whatever.
It still is. It still is.
Still is.
Yeah.
That's what the question was so do I need to stick with one, or should I bounce back and forth? And that's the reason why I said at the beginning that I don't endorse just one, because you're going to be doing that. So if I come out here and say, hey, this is the best thing, then that's going against, because you're going to be using a variety of different treatments probably when you're doing your
And weather makes a difference too for different types of treatments. Like formic acid, you want it to be fairly warm in order to even utilize it properly. So there's a lot of different stuff to actually go into when you get into mite treatments. Like the first thing you probably want to look into is how to actually check for mites. And there's a couple different methods to look up. There's what are known as ether rolls. There's the sugar method. So it just kind of depends on how well you want to do it. I've always preferred the ether roll just because of how quick it is. You basically just take an ether fluid, starter fluid, and you get around 100 bees inside a little jar. You just spray it in there. It kills them all. Then you shake the jar really, really vigorously, and then you pour out the bees, and you count how many bees there are, and all the mites will be stuck around the jar, if there are mites. And then you count how many mites there are in comparison to bees, and of course that gives you your ratio. And anything above a 40%, your hive's probably gonna decline quickly, because anything above a 3% is where you're gonna want to treat. I mean, even if you see mites anyway, you're gonna want to treat anyway, because most likely, as I was discussing, that they exist within the cap brood. So you might not even be seeing the first onset of mites. You're just catching like maybe that one or two that haven't gotten out yet or haven't bred yet, and so now you're going to have a whole rush of them. So it's better to treat just the moment you see any mites.
We got any more questions?
I got 3 more. Can you buy prepackaged bee feed or just give them honey from another hive?
Okay, it's not recommended to give, that's a trick question. Honey from another hive, when I said you're starting with 2 hives, if you know where the honey is coming from and the hive's healthy in your own apiary, you can pull some frames of honey and put in there. You don't want to feed honey from the stores because you could be spreading disease that way too. So you don't go buy a bottle of honey and feed it back to your hive.
Yeah.
The other thing is, yeah, you can buy supplemental feeds. They have a full line that'll be within Coastal too. They carry it. It's just a pre-mixed syrup. It's usually got essential oils in it, and usually by the time you're buying that and mixing essential oils in it, it's usually about a fairly decent cost savings between you trying to have to go do it yourself. So, and you'll also feed a pollen substitute at certain times of the year too. So it's different from just, when we talked about what they were feeding, and he was talking about the bee bread on that slide. So they're feeding the young. They take a little bit of pollen, they mix it with a little bit of honey, and they mix it together and they feed that and they make bee bread. So at that time when they're feeding the young, they have to have that pollen source, and that's when they're going to be really brooding up. And depending on the area that you're in and what's coming in, you want that brood production to be really strong when you get a good nectar flow to come on. So you're going to supplemental feed this stuff to get them to entice the queen to start laying more and increase brood production to be ready to go. So.
Yep.
2 more. We have wild bees, and my son has a few hives. Is it bad? And if not, how far apart should they be placed?
So wild bees or native bees, there's a difference between, I think you can have like a feral hive, so I don't know what they're talking about on that. But native bees and honeybees coexist just as fine. So you're talking about like mason bees, bumblebees,
Yeah.
you know, they kind of coexist and work with each other.
Blue orchard bees, whatever, yeah.
Yeah, you have all different leaf cutters. Honeybees are actually going to be out pollinating in a larger force, and that's actually going to spur more food for your natural pollinators that are there too, because they're out there. You know, you've got in a hive, you start out in a package with about 10,000 bees in a 3-pound package of bees. That's what they're carrying here. By the time that colony's in full force, you'll have about 60,000 bees. So they're out there hitting, but that's not bad. I mean, they're hitting within a 5-mile radius. They're hitting all these different plants, and it spurs more growth, and it helps actually your wildlife and everything else because it's better feed and more
nutrients are being, yeah. Basically, the plants survive better because those bees are pollinating them properly. So
it'll help everything else. So you could have them right. They've taken mason bees and honeybees and they put them in the almonds together because there was a time where they figured that they would work in conjunction better and they can coexist just fine. So.
no.
One more. I have a very large organic garden. Should I place the beehive on the north side or the south side? Temperatures get very cold in the winter. Should I cover them?
Okay, so the question was north side or the south side. I would, because your bees are going to go up within 5 miles like we talked about from where it is. I don't think that matters except for you want to do like Justin talked about, morning sun, afternoon shade. That's better because then they're going to get that morning sun, they're going to heat up and they're going to start working earlier. And then when it's hot in the afternoon and they got that shade coming on, they're not working so much to keep the hive cool. So that's more better of a better example on where you want to do it. And then what was the second part of it?
It said temperatures get very cold in the winter. Should I
Should you cover your hive? So there's a lot of people that will insulate hives. You want to make sure the main thing that you want to do is make sure they have plenty of ventilation. So it's not really the cold temperatures that are going to kill the hives. You want to make sure they have ventilation because it's a wet cold that does it. You get dripping that comes down on them. And I don't know, I come from a family that was brick masons forever, and the coldest winter was in the spring when we get a snow and it would drip down on us and you have that ice water on you. So think about that when you're doing with your bees. And the next big thing is when you're going into winter, your bees, and you go to extract your honey, make sure that you're leaving about a full deep box of honey for them. And that's how they generate their heat, is they're going to be eating that honey source and they cluster up, and then that gives them the fuel that they kind of shiver. And they'll keep the inside of that hive at
95.
95, 98 degrees like our body, you know.
Yeah.
So
it's pretty good thermoregulated in the inside. You'd be surprised.
So that's the key of it. Any other questions?
Have you heard about the use of mushrooms to keep the bees healthy?
I haven't heard about mushrooms on it. I know there's a lot of different research that's going on, different things. That's like I said, we're
Are you talking about at the University of Washington? Yeah, there's a gentleman up there right now. He's using it to do an antiviral program. I mean, it could be on something. Mycelium is really, really good at breaking apart almost anything. I mean, that's what happens in the soils. That's what breaks apart toxins in the soil is usually mycelium in conjunction with other organic supplements, which is in some ways kind of what's in my product. I don't use a fungal extract. I use some polyphenols and along with beneficial microbes. So, but yeah, there is a possibility that fungi could be one day one of the deterrents for not only viruses, but there's a few species that I'm currently working with to combat mites. So, yeah, it's definitely a possibility.
So I talked to somebody at Coastal, and they said you're getting 2 different types of bees this year, and I'm wondering what they are, and what is the benefit one over the other, and is one more docile than the other?
So you got a Carniolan and an Italian, the 2 different types of bees that they're going to be providing through Coastal. A lot of new beekeepers, and it's recommended to start with an Italian. They're going to they'll be a little bit more docile. They've been bred that way. More commercial guys are using Italians than anywhere else. Colder areas are a little darker bee where the Carniolan is, and they think that they do a little bit better in that. They'll build up a little slower in the spring, but they'll stay a little bit larger to go into fall. So
Which one does?
Carniolan. It's an all black bee. So you got an all black bee, and the other one's like it's called a 3-band Italian. The end of it, the queen, you'll see it on
you
her.
see like the bands on the picture.
Yeah, they'll have those 3 lines on the back. So that's kind of like your medium bee, kind of like it spreads, like it has like benefits like equally of almost everything kind of in between. I think the Italian's probably the most utilized at the most.
It is, and the thing about this is too, is remember when you're getting your stuff, so your queen is going to come out, it's going to be a little darker color, or you're going to have, if you have Italian, it's going to be a little lighter, but the only way that you're going to get a purebred bee is that if you have it artificially inseminated. So most of these people are open breeding their bees, most of these breeders, so you get it and they take that genetic from it. But whatever drone, so bees don't mate with the male bees from their own hive, they go on a mating flight. That's how they spread their genetics. And whatever bees drones that queen mated with is going to show up in their young. So keep that in mind when you're ordering your package.
Yeah, those 40 drones that she gets mated with. So
she's going to have genetics from wide.
But that also prevents them from being able to succumb to just one type of disease, you know, because that kind of makes a variance in the genetic makeup too. So.
I have one more.
Perfect.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
We live next door to an orchard. When they bring bees in there very close to our yard, can I still have a hive of my own?
You can. So the question was, if I take it to a little different level, I live next to a place where they'll bring in commercial bees for pollination. Those bees that are coming in for pollination are only going to be there for a few weeks, so you'll be fine. So as long as you're not starting out with a brand new package when they come in, because we talked about them robbing, you know, you'll be all right. But if you do have a brand new package when they are coming in, you want to utilize that introducer so they can defend themselves against other colonies, because you'll have colonies coming from California out the almonds that are just super strong, and you're going to have a really weak hive that's trying to build its way up, and they're just really easy pickings for a strong hive. So you make sure you use your introducer when you start out.
You're also going to want to look for any type of new disease signs that might come, because like that's why they call the biggest bee migration in basically the world is what's taking place right now in California. It's also basically a breeding ground for disease, because you don't know how well this guy took care of his bees compared to this guy. So this guy might have one disease that you didn't have, and you were preventing something else, and then all of a sudden here comes this disease into your hive, and it just wrecks your hive because you weren't prepared for it. So you have to also kind of be prepared for that too. Most diseases you can't actually physically see. There's only a few indicators of bee diseases, so it's usually easier to just be preventative on the diseases, and that's using certain types of treatments to be able to be preventative on that line, which once again, that is exactly what AppyCare is designed for, is to be preventative. So that way, even if they come into contact with a high amount of disease, they're sufficiently guarded against it, and you don't have to worry about it.
Your bees that are, if you order from Coastal, are going to all come in from Northern California anyways, so this is where the source is going to be from. And most of your bees, there's like 2.3 million hives that are trucked to California every year to do pollination on it. I mean, it's the Super Bowl, they call it, of beekeeping. And it's the biggest thing that dictates when your bees and everything that are gonna come in. Like people, why can't I get a package, like, right, you know, it's starting to warm up, my spring's coming on. Well, it's all gonna dictate when the almond bloom. They get paid a lot of money for almond pollination, so they're gonna be there until they get it done. And the synergy between commercial beekeeper and hobbyists, I hear a lot of flack from people that get mad about commercial beekeepers. I work with both of them. We supply, but I work with commercial beekeepers. I work with hobbyists. Thing as a hobbyist is you need to look at is you wouldn't have your bees if you didn't have a commercial beekeeper. And for them to have a surplus of bees that they can make your packages on, it means that they're probably doing it pretty right because you have healthy bees enough that you can shake packages. So, any other questions?
Awesome. Awesome.
We good?
Well, thank you guys both so much for being here. I know I always learn a lot, learn something new every time that we chat. So thank you. For everybody that is watching online, we are going to go ahead and wrap up, but we will be drawing a winner and contacting you. So thank you for all your questions, all of your comments. We will be picking one lucky winner for that bee package out of everybody watching online. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up our online broadcast, and for everyone who is here in person, we have some goodies for you, so you guys can all hang out for a little bit. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we will chat with you guys soon.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.